One war changed everything. Before Ramza Beoulve ever set foot on a battlefield, Ivalice had already been drained by a struggle that lasted half a century. For 50 long years, soldiers marched across the same burned plains, and entire generations grew old beneath banners that promised glory but delivered hunger and loss. When the final truce was signed, nothing remained of the pride that had once driven the kingdom to war. This conflict shaped every injustice that followed. The gulf between nobles and commoners widened until it became a wound that never healed. The treasury lay empty, the farms barren, and the people no longer trusted the crown that had sent them to fight. Even the church, once the moral heart of the realm, learned to profit from despair. Historians later called it the 50 Years' War, a name that sounded neat and contained, though the damage it left behind was anything but. Its true legacy was silence, the quiet that falls when a nation runs out of faith, out of gold, and out of sons. Long before scholars debated the truth of the Zodiac Braves, one historian tried to set the record straight. His name was Arazlam Durai. Centuries after the War of the Lions, he uncovered a forgotten manuscript, the Durai Papers. Inside were first-hand accounts that contradicted the church's official history. Letters, diaries, and battlefield reports from the age of Ramza Beoulve. Risking censure, or worse, Arazlam compiled these writings into a single work he called the War Chronicle. To him, the fall of kings and the rise of heretics were not myths, but lessons. He believed that truth was a duty, even when the world preferred legend. His narration begins not with heroes or miracles, but with a war older than Ramza's time. The 50 Years' War. Conflict that drained Ivalice of its wealth, faith, and future. Arazlam's words invite us to look beyond glory and see the cost that history tries to forget. The chronicle he preserved became the foundation for everything we know about Ivalice. Without it, the deeds of Ramza, Delita, and the Beoulves would have vanished into rumor. What follows is his story, retold from the records he dared to save. At the western edge of a rugged peninsula lay the kingdom of Ivalice. Its hills rolled toward the sea, dotted with farmlands and ancient keeps. To the east stretched Ordalia, a vast realm of plains and deserts divided by mountain passes. Between them set a narrow borderland of fertile valleys. That land, rich in grain and iron, was coveted by both crowns. For generations, uneasy truces had kept the peace. Merchants crossed the frontier to trade, and minor skirmishes flared but faded quickly. Yet resentment lingered. Ivalice's kings believed the old treaties had robbed them of rightful territory. Ordalia's rulers saw Ivalice as a fading power unfit to control such wealth. By the reign of King Dinamda II in Ivalice and King Divan III in Ordalia, tension had hardened into ambition. When Dinamda pressed a claim to the Ordalian throne through distant bloodlines, the dispute turned political and personal. Nobles whispered of opportunity. Generals saw a chance for glory. The contested province of Zelmonia became the spark. Its lords swore allegiance to both crowns depending on who offered better protection. Raids along its borders escalated into formal invasion, and the balance of power in the west began to tilt toward war. Ivalice entered the struggle confident and proud. The kingdom's knights were seasoned, its banners bright with faith and divine favor. Ordalia answered with numbers and resolve, calling on allies across the eastern plains. Behind both thrones stood courts hungry for profit and prestige. To those who lived through it, the coming conflict felt inevitable. The frontier that had once connected two kingdoms became a line that would divide them for half a century. The spark of conflict caught. Ordalia's armies crossed the frontier and swept through Zelmonia before Ivalice could rally its defenses. Villages burned along the border while messengers raced to Lassalia with news that the invasion had begun. King Dinamda II called the banners. Knights from every duchy assembled, shining in armor that still carried the memory of old triumphs. They marched east believing the campaign would be swift, a righteous defense that would remind Ordalia of Ivalice's strength. But within months, the war widened beyond anything the court had planned. Ordalia gained powerful support from across the sea. Romanda, a northern kingdom seeking control of trade routes, sent ships, gold, and engineers to aid the eastern cause. Ivalice stood largely alone. To fill its ranks, the crown ordered mass levies. Peasants, apprentices, even debtors were pressed into service. Mercenary companies followed, drawn by promises of plunder. Early campaigns brought confusion more than victory. Ordalian forces pushed deep into Gallion before winter, forcing Ivalice's army to retreat to fortified towns. Supplies dwindled, and sickness spread through the camps. The king replaced generals almost yearly, each promising success and leaving behind another field of graves. As the war consumed its first decade, pride hardened into obsession. What had begun as defense became crusade, and both sides declared divine right to the same soil. For the people of the borderlands, the banners mattered little. The armies changed, but the burning never stopped. Years turned to decades. What began as a campaign for pride became a cycle of attrition that neither kingdom could escape. The early years favored Ordalia. Its armies pushed far into the Ivalician frontier, seizing strongholds and blockading river routes. Grain caravans burned, and trade across the sea collapsed. But among the chaos rose new commanders, men whose skill and willpower refused surrender. Among them stood Balbanes Beoulve, a knight whose strategies rescued Ivalice from collapse. Under his command, the Order of the Northern Sky retook fortress after fortress, cutting deep into enemy lines. For a time, his name carried the hope of a weary kingdom. Yet even his brilliance could not overcome exhaustion. Each victory demanded years of recovery. Fields lay empty, every harvest went to feed soldiers. Entire towns vanished into supply chains that led only to the front. By the war's midpoint, the conflict settled into stalemate. The same castles changed hands over and over. Winters were spent in siege, summers in retreat. Disease claimed as many lives as battle. The noble houses funding the war sank under debt. Gold lost its worth. Promises replaced coin. Knights, once honored for valor, began selling their swords to the highest bidder. Peasants, drafted by the thousands, deserted to form wandering bands that robbed travelers and burned estates. Famine followed. Mothers sold heirlooms for bread. Priests blessed empty altars because the relics had been melted for pay. Still, the kings pressed on, bound by pride in the illusion that one more campaign might justify the suffering. After 20 years, both sides fought mostly to avoid shame. Soldiers marched without conviction, their banners torn and colorless from sun and rain. Even victory brought no joy, only another season of rebuilding walls destined to fall again. the 50 Years' War devoured not only lives but meaning. For a generation, Ivalice forgot what peace felt like. As the decades dragged on, faith became the only currency still trusted. The Church of Glabados stood apart from the fighting, at least in appearance. Priests offered blessings to both crowns, preaching that divine order would one day restore balance. To the common folk, the church seemed a refuge. In truth, it was watching, waiting, and counting its opportunities. While armies bled across the continent, the church filled the gaps left by failing governments. Monasteries fed refugees when nobles could not. Tithes continued even when taxes failed. In the eyes of the people, the Holy Church had done what kings could not. It had endured. Behind cloistered doors, however, its hierarchy debated more than salvation. As gold poured into its coffers, the clergy financed mercenary groups and sold indulgences to desperate nobles seeking divine favor. The war's misery became their wealth. With every year, sermons shifted from humility to obedience. The faithful were told that only through the church could Ivalice find redemption. By the war's final decade, bishops influenced strategy as much as generals. The church supplied healers, soldiers, and spies. When peace finally arrived, its reach extended through every village and fortress. The people saw survival as a miracle. The church called it providence, and quietly claimed credit for both. When the war seemed endless, one name carried the weight of hope: Balbanes Beoulve. He rose from minor nobility in Gallion, trained under veteran knights who had already seen too many battles. Unlike most commanders, he listened to his soldiers. He walked the camps, shared their food, and learned what hunger and frost did to morale. Those habits earned loyalty long before he earned titles. Balbanes' rise began during Ivalice's darkest hours. Ordalian armies had captured key forts along the northern passes, cutting trade and isolating provinces. The king appointed Balbanes to reclaim them, expecting little from a young officer. He returned months later with the enemy banners folded beneath his own. That campaign changed the war's rhythm. His strategies favored precision over spectacle, small strikes that preserved lives and won ground through cunning rather than sheer numbers. Soldiers called him the Lion of Gallion, though he refused the name. He told his captains that courage meant restraint. The fewer the graves, the greater the victory. Such ideals set him apart from nobles who fought for pride. His reputation spread through taverns and temples alike. For commoners, he was proof that honor had not vanished. For his Hotukan knights, he became the measure of discipline. Even Ordalian chroniclers recorded admiration for his conduct, noting that his prisoners were treated fairly and returned after truce. Balbanes' final campaigns restored much of the territory Ivalice had lost. Yet success could not change the kingdom's fatigue. Gold and manpower dwindled. Politics poisoned command. Rumors whispered that jealous courtiers feared his influence. And near the war's end, Balbanes fell ill from poison said to have been slipped into his wine. His death broke the last unity the army possessed. With him died the belief that the war could still end with honor. Yet his story was not the only legend to rise from that age. In the southern provinces, another commander fought with equal brilliance and humility: Count Cidolfus Orlandeau. Where Balbanes led the northern sky, Orlandeau commanded the southern sky knights. The two men never sought rivalry. They shared correspondence, strategies, and at times coordinated joint offensives that turned desperate defenses into measured victories. Orlandeau earned the title Thunder God after breaking a siege at Zelmonia by leading a night assault through lightning and rain. His blade, a rune-etched sword said to channel the storm itself, became a symbol of divine favor. Unlike many lords, he refused indulgence or reward. When troops lacked rations, he sold his own estates to feed them. Those gestures made him beloved among common soldiers, and even respected by enemies who faced him. Between the northern and southern skies stood another order, the Eastern Sky. Formed from border garrisons near Lassalia and Favahum, its task was to guard the royal heartland. Unlike the knightly hosts sworn to nobles, the Eastern Sky answered directly to the crown. Its ranks mixed idealists and opportunists, men who had grown weary of endless war. Among them served Gaffgarion, a capable yet ruthless knight who embodied the conflict's moral decay. Once praised for his tactical brilliance, he grew infamous for raiding villages under pretext of supply and for taking coin from both sides. When his brutal actions reached the capital, the crown dismissed him, stripping his banner. He turned mercenary soon after. It is easy to see in him the dark mirror of Balbaneth, proof of what happened when the code of chivalry no longer bound the sword or the swordsman. Together, Balbaneth and Orlandeau represented the dying ideal of the noble knight. Gaffgarion and the Eastern Skies showed what would ultimately replace it. As Ivalice staggered toward defeat, these three names, one honored, one revered, and one condemned, defined how history would remember the war's final generation. Their legacies, divided as night from dawn, as black lion from white, set the board and forged the age of heretics and palace intrigue that followed. By the war's final chapters, the strength of both kingdoms had worn thin. Yet Ordalia still held an edge. Its alliance with Ramza brought fresh troops, engineers, and supplies from across the sea. Ivalice, cut off from trade and crippled by debt, could no longer match its enemies' numbers. King Denamda IV, the latest to inherit a fading throne, struggled to maintain order among his own dukes. The treasury emptied, and his court dissolved into quarrels over who would pay the soldiers still at the front. Many nobles raised local taxes to survive, pushing commoners into revolt. As Ordalia advanced again, desperation replaced strategy. Commanders ordered assaults with dwindling forces. Fortresses, once thought impregnable, fell after brief sieges. When the royal army refused another winter campaign, the king had little choice. He sought peace, not through victory, but exhaustion. The treaty that ended the war offered no illusions. Ivalice surrendered its eastern provinces and agreed to pay reparations over a decade. The gesture saved what remained of the crown, but shattered its prestige. Returning soldiers found no celebration, only silence. The banners came down, the bells never rang, and the people waited for a prosperity that never arrived. In the end, both sides claimed endurance as their triumph. For Ivalice, that claim was hollow. The war had drained its gold, its blood, and its faith. What lingered, however, was resentment. Nobles blaming peasants for failure, peasants blaming nobles for greed, and a nation left without pride or purpose. At long last, peace arrived, but no one celebrated. The armies returned to a homeland they barely recognized. Fields lay fallow, towns stood half empty, and families waited for sons who would never come home. The nobles who survived returned to estates stripped bare by war taxes and looting. Many had traded their heirlooms for grain long before the treaty was signed. The veterans, who had once fought for king and country, found themselves discarded. Promised pensions never arrived. Hungry and armed, they drifted into mercenary bands that turned on the people they once defended. Among these outcasts rose the first whispers of a new movement, the Corpse Brigade. It began as a brotherhood of abandoned soldiers seeking justice, but grief and bitterness twisted it into rebellion. Commoners fared no better. After half a century of levies and famine, many saw the nobility as parasites. Peasant uprisings broke out across the border provinces. Lords responded with brutal reprisals, convinced that fear was the only way to restore order. The result was further collapse. Only the Church of Glabados seemed untouched. Its priests offered food and faith to the displaced, filling the void left by the crown. Villages rebuilt around monasteries instead of castles. The people began to trust the cloth more than the sword. Behind the sermons, the church quietly expanded its influence, preparing to shape the next era of Ivalice according to its own designs. In taverns and marketplaces, people spoke of the war as if it had been a sickness that never truly left. Everyone carried its scars, some visible, some buried deep. The kingdom had survived, but survival no longer felt like victory. It felt like penance. The war's long shadow reached far beyond its final treaty. Every story in Ivalice that followed, from palace intrigue to peasant revolt, began in that silence after defeat. For Ramza Beoulve, the story was not history, but inheritance. He grew up in a household that still bore its honors and its wounds. His father's banner hung behind his death mask, a reminder that loyalty to the crown had claimed the best of men and repaid them with betrayal. When Ramza later questioned the justice of his own nobles, he was answering the echoes of that loss. Delita Heiral came from the other side of the same divide. His family had been crushed by the war's poverty. Watching noble sons inherit titles while commoners buried their kin filled him with a resolve that no sermon could calm. Together, Ramza and Delita embodied the fracture the war left behind. Birth against merit, truth against power. The Church of Glabados, strengthened by decades of quiet growth, used that divide to tighten its hold on the kingdom. Its promises of peace and salvation masked a hunger for control. In time, its influence reached every throne and battlefield. By the age of the War of the Lions, Ivalice was ready to collapse again. The 50 Years' War had ended, but its consequences kept marching. Every rebellion, every secret, every act of faith or treachery in Final Fantasy Tactics traced back to that long defeat. In the end, the 50 Years' War was remembered less for the battles than for what it took away. A kingdom that once dreamed of glory awoke to ruin. The maps changed, but the suffering remained. Half a century of war had consumed its children and its faith. The kings who started it were long dead. and the people left behind carried a quiet grief that shaped their lives more deeply than any victory could. From that grief came rebellion, deceit, and the endless struggle for meaning that defined Ivalice's next age. When historians later searched for lessons, they found no heroes, only warnings. The cost of ambition, the fragility of loyalty, the danger of belief turned into power. Each had written its mark upon the realm. The story of Ivalice did not end when the swords were sheathed. It merely changed shape. The same hunger, the same pride, would rise again in the War of the Lions. The 50 Years' War had ended, but its echo carried forward. And that echo became the world of Final Fantasy Tactics.